A few years ago, a priest in Illinois made waves when he told the story of standing in the sacristy after Mass one particular Sunday. Because all of a sudden, a stranger barged in, and in an incriminating huff, he said, "I have been away from the area for 15 years. Where are the people? And now you are tearing down the school? I went there as a kid." The priest put his hands up to quiet the gentleman from further talking and calmly replied, "Let me ask you a question. How many kids did you have?" The stranger said, "2." The priest said, "So did everyone else. When you have only 2 kids per family, there is no growth." The stranger's demeanor changed, and then he dropped his head and lamented, "And they are not even going to Mass anymore." There is a vocations crisis in much of the Western world today. Let me stress, there is a vocations crisis. I say vocations, not a vocation singular, because both sacraments of vocation, marriage, and holy orders are in crisis in some parts of the world. And yes, even baptism, we can say, is a sacrament of vocation, in the sense that each baptized Christian receives the very same vocation to grow in holiness and friendship with God. There is a crisis there as well, as we heard the man sadly relate that his 2 kids no longer went to Mass. Now, I'm going to propose to you that all 3 share the same root cause: sacrifice, or rather the absence of value of true sacrifice. Many of us have forgotten the value of sacrifice. Priesthood and religious life both require sacrifice, especially sacrificing of that great and holy good of one's own family. In the first reading in the Gospel, we see a kind of mirror situation. But in the Gospel, the proclamation of the kingdom of God is so critical and so important that Jesus demands that even the most basic family demands be sacrificed for the greater good. Demands that any pious Jew would rather perish than not observe. Where is the sacrifice? Too often we have stressed in modern times the Eucharist simply as a common meal, a community gathering, while putting aside that self-sacrificial aspect which is so central, as too uncomfortable or too dated. But think about it. If it's just a community meal with no lesson about the value of sacrificial love, with no demands for us to sacrifice as well, then what value would there be for his children? Why not simply just go out and eat with friends? That's a community meal. That's a gathering. To be blunt, a good chunk of that goes to us priests who did not preach that sacrificial love of God in the Eucharist enough. And because so many families are having so few kids, the idea of giving up a child to priesthood or religious life becomes, in a way, more sacrificial. Now trust me, I know. At first, my own mom was not exactly, shall we say, overjoyed at the prospect of losing a chance at more grandchildren when I told her I was entering the Dominicans. Many of my Dominican brothers tell the same story, especially those coming in these days. For the days when families would routinely have 7 children and perhaps offer 1 or 2 for God are mostly past in our nation. How could I give up my only son? Is a common lament that we friars hear. It's a good question, but one that we should be thankful that God the Father did not answer the same way that we do. Now, that priest from Illinois did not mention one other thing that led to that man's sadness. That when fewer men and women choose to follow religious life or priesthood, the cheap labor pool, shall we say, dried up for parochial schools. It's fine that we now have good lay teachers in many of our schools, because without them we simply could not stay open. But Justice demands that we pay lay teachers a living wage to support their own families. And that drives the cost of tuition up, which means even fewer kids can go to parochial schools out of an even smaller pool of potential students, so more parish schools close. It's a vicious cycle. So we go back to that core problem then, sacrifice. Now, most of the world knows the value of sacrifice, but in a very limited way. Now, we might sacrifice some things, but often in this world we sacrifice them in order to become what we might call self-empowered, self-fulfilled, forgetting in a way that this is not the highest sacrifice because it is for a purely selfish goal. Where is the sacrifice for the other? Our nation was founded on sacrifice for an ideal. Our nation was founded on life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Well, life has gone out the window with abortion. Liberty has gone out the window when we give it up for security. And believe it or not, we gave up the pursuit of happiness long ago. Wait, how can we have given up the pursuit of happiness? Isn't this what everyone lives for in our nation? Well, pursuit of happiness, when it was written, did not mean hedonism or living a life as we simply saw fit with license to do whatever we wanted. That's a historical misrepresentation and not what the Founding Fathers had in mind. Happiness had nothing to do with careers or possessions, but with virtue. Happiness was historically equated with a life of virtue, a life that allowed contemplation of higher things. To pursue happiness meant to strive for that virtue according to one's own calling in society for others. Think about it. Most people throughout human history had and continue to have very little choice in profession or family affairs. The idea of truly pursuing happiness by doing our own thing is very new and very strange, historically speaking. Ironically, this newer, more self-centered notion of sacrifice is going to come around and hit the very same people who live it the most and hit them the hardest. Because with a shrinking and diminishing pool of children who grow up to become working adults, supporting the sick and elderly becomes more and more financially onerous. Euthanasia and eugenics are but means of making sure that those who are young and alive now have to sacrifice less in the future. Since more children are not coming down the pipeline, the so-called weak have to be called in order for the whole system to not collapse under its own weight. We see this already in Europe, committing a kind of demographic suicide, and where involuntary euthanasia has quietly grown in state institutions under the mask of compassion, but really it's more budgetary than anything else. And even more ironic is that when we sacrifice children, when we sacrifice family for careers, for wealth, for a phantom pursuit of happiness, we are often sacrificing that same happiness we claim to seek. We confuse material riches with the riches of familial love, of a family where each member sacrifices something so that the others may have enough and prosper themselves. Well, we have the most any other generation has ever had in human history. We are rich beyond the dreams of avarice. Are we happy as a whole? If we are, our society has a rather odd way of manifesting. So what is the solution? Everyone go out and have more kids? Well, yes and no. Having more kids in itself is not the solution. Some couples simply cannot have more kids. And a family of 2 might well be much holier and more sacrificial than a family of 20. But we have to get rid of the idea, first, of separating sacrifice and love. We have to get rid of the idea of separating the marital act then from its natural, organic end, which is the procreation and begetting of life, especially within that context of sacrificial and unitive love. Artificial contraception goes against the very purpose of love, the very fabric of our being, both natural and supernatural. Artificial contraception has to end. All the bad fruit from artificial contraception that Pope Paul VI preached about generations ago has come to fruition. Abortion, greater divorce, loss of respect for life, family disintegration. All this is tied together in the big picture. Now, some might protest, but we have immigration, Father. Isn't this what some of our politicians say? Well, we'll just fix it with immigration. That now is short-sighted, because those immigrants who do come here quickly become very Americanized in at least one respect, and that is contraception. Their birth rates plummet. Not to mention that in the West, including our own nation, we are strongly shoving abortion and contraception down the throats of poor countries, threatening them, holding them hostage, saying, if you want any aid, if you want food or medicine, you better take abortion and you better take contraception. Not realizing that we are shooting ourselves in the same foot that we hope would keep us out of the grave. Now, yes, having more children does require more sacrifice. But all love requires a sacrifice, something of ourselves. Put any kind of barrier, artificial, whatever, between love and sacrifice will eventually weaken both with disastrous results. You don't have to take my word for it. I always encourage people, read the official church teachings on whatever it is on contraception. And look around you, not just here, but in the world. Where are all the kids? Where is our church? Where is our society? We might find to our horror that those questions are more related, more interconnected than we might care to admit.